Good morning, Dan and Amy. So, Amy, one of my favorite blogs is Marginal Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
It's a blog that's curated by Tyler Cowen. He's an economist at George Mason University and also an author of a number of bestsellers. Average is Over. He's got a new book, The Complacent Class, The Self-Defeating Quest for the American Dream. And you're probably asking yourself, well, who is the complacent class?
And
What has happened to America's strivers? Why is seeking the American dream a self-defeating quest? Are these questions that are crossing your mind right now?
every day.
Every day? Every day you wonder about this complacent class?
The complacent class.
That is an untruth. That is fake news because that's a term that Tyler Cowen has coined for the purpose of his new book, The Complacent Class. And we're pleased to be joined now by the aforesaid George Mason University economist and best-selling author, Tyler Cowen. Tyler, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. So let me see. I want to get you to expound on the thesis of your book, The Complacent Class, but can you put it in a little context for me? Because I read Average is Over, which was very good. So how does Average is Over intersect with The Complacent Class and the self-defeating quest to achieve the American dream?
Complacent Class is a book about how America is losing its mojo, that we're changing jobs less often, we move across state lines less often, we innovate less, we're less entrepreneurial. So it's a story about what's going wrong in America today.
Well, a lot of people don't move or change jobs because of this thing called loyalty. And a lot of people are accused of being too loyal, and that affects them personally and financially. Do you agree with that?
Yes, it also means that our labor markets slow down. So when a recession comes, unemployment lasts for longer. It's harder to find a new job. It's harder to reestablish yourself somewhere else. So behavior that's rational for the individual can actually be worse at the national level.
But then in Average is Over, you argue that high earners are taking more advantage of innovation and machine intelligence and achieving ever better results. And so is this something where you're talking about the complacent class? These are people that are not the ones that are positioned to take advantage of these innovations. So it's a small group of people that are succeeding and a large group of people that are being left behind?
Exactly, and the most dynamic element in American society, I think it's typically in Silicon Valley. People who build the super tech companies, yes, they are dynamic, but the nation as a whole, most of the data are pointing in the opposite direction.
And so kind of what is the, where does this go as artificial intelligence and innovation continues to push forward, as it always should, I would think?
Sure. I think at some point we will get to a kind of social break where we try to lock ourselves into current institutions more and more and slow down change more and more. But at some point you have to pay the bills. So I think politically we're already seeing radical shifts in what America is about, and I think that will be followed by a more general fraying of a lot of our institutions.
So how did you react when you saw the story over the weekend that Bill Gates suggesting that robots that replace human workers should be taxed? I mean, is that essentially kind of a lead? I mean, it sounds silly at first, but is that kind of a leading indicator of what you're talking about in the complacent class?
Yes, and I also wondered what he meant by robots. Because of Microsoft Word, we don't need to employ as many typists. We're all typists.
Right, yes, right, yeah.
So does he want to tax that too?
It's a fair follow-up question that was not asked, as far as I know.
So when it comes to matters of the heart, you said that we're marrying people more like ourselves. Is that true?
That's correct. And, the old days, which were maybe never quite that good, but you would marry people you lived close to or you went to high school with. Now you're much more likely that, say, one law partner marries another law partner. That's good for them, but I think it also limits upward mobility for other people. It's harder to marry up today than in the past.
Is this part of, or kind of does it fly in formation with Charles Murray's work on essentially how thick is your bubble, and the idea of communities, that not just individuals but communities living very different existences and able to live those existences without concern for the community just next door.
That's right. And I would say today the biggest bubble in this country is probably the coastal elites bubble.
Yeah. So if we're complacent and we don't want to change jobs, how eventually is that going to destroy us economically?
I don't think destroy is quite the right word, but productivity growth has slowed down, economic growth has slowed down, recovery from the Great Recession was quite disappointing. And I think over time, our institutions, our politics will get worse in subtle or sometimes obvious ways, and something will have to give at some point. I think in the longer run, dynamism will reemerge, and America will reinvent ourselves. But right now, up ahead, before us, those are the bumps on the road.
Yeah, you wrote a piece, I remember, a few years back when this construct, trying to kind of segment people in the country, you were critical of this idea of makers versus takers. And I agreed with the piece. I thought it was a good insight. You know, who's a maker and who's a taker is somebody who is on Medicare but paid into the Medicare system their entire life. And so they're getting $2.50 for every dollar they paid in. But that was the deal the government set forward, so they held up their end. Is that a maker or is that a taker? I think that's a good question. So, but laying that foundation, where does the makers versus takers go in this period of essentially what you're arguing is stagnation in certain quarters with government unable to pay its bills? I suppose that's what you're talking about when you get to kind of a political reordering that will be necessary.
That's right. And what we observe in the data is Democrats are more keen to live next door to other Democrats, and the same is true for Republicans. So you get these different parts of the country that are literally shocked by what people believe in the other part or what they might want to vote for. And that makes it much harder to solve the problem of untangling, who should be given what in terms of redistribution.
Well, and I would think that must be particularly the case in big urban centers. I think the biggest city with a Republican mayor is San Diego, and that's well down the list of most populous cities.
Sure.
So, but I mean, so urban centers that are monolithic but have a disproportionate impact on a state. You know, we're here in Chicago; it has a disproportionate impact on Illinois, even though there's a lot of the rest of Illinois that doesn't exactly come from the same place as Chicago. You know, how do you see that fleshing itself out?
Well, it's now possible to drive across the country and not pass through a county that voted for Hillary Clinton. That's another way to put the same point. I think we're headed for a time that will in some ways resemble the 1960s and 70s. There'll be a lot more turmoil and much less consensus. There'll be a lot more public demonstration. But this time around, it will be souped up with a lot more social media. I think simply holding on is the best thing we can do as Americans, that I think this country still has a lot of strengths. But again, I think the next 20 years, 30 years will have much more turmoil than, say, the 1980s or 90s did.
Are you surprised by the left not being able to concede that Donald Trump has won this election when you speak of these protests?
I wouldn't say I'm surprised, but I think it's a sign of fraying consensus that people are not looking at the same world.
And part of it, I would suggest, is media, because media creates community. That's what media does. It always has. Everybody watches the same 10 o'clock news in a metropolitan area. They're talking about the same thing. But in the digitization of media and the 21st century media landscape, since we're talking about media so much these days, you run a very popular blog, Marginal Revolution, that I mentioned at the outset. That also tends to fracture community, right? Because I don't have to read the New York Times or the Washington Post, or I don't have to read the Daily Caller or Marginal Revolution or the Washington Examiner. I can pick and choose and, kind of just stay in my lane.
There's an old joke dating back from 1972. One of the intellectuals of that time said, Richard Nixon cannot have won the election. No one I know voted for him.
Yeah, Pauline Kael.
I think we're seeing that once again.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you something else about the series of books that you've written is very interesting to me. Great Stagnation, Average is Over, and now The Complacent Class, your latest offering. And it got me thinking about Neil Ferguson's book, The Great Degeneration, talking about civic institutions in Western democracies that are disintegrating, the kind of the cornerstones of a free society. And I wonder if you also have those concerns about the foundations of a free society also fraying at the edges.
If you look at the world as a whole, the number of authoritarian governments has gone up over the last 10 years. And that, to me, is very disturbing, and I don't think it will be reversed anytime soon. Russia, China, Turkey, parts of the Middle East up in flames. So my book is about America, but the broader story is about the world. And in some ways, we're moving backwards, and it worries me that it looks a bit like, say, 1910 in some ways.
Well, so if the world is going through this period of tumult and America is going through this period of tumult that you compare to maybe the kind of the 60s, how do we get to the other side of a more stable, better place that addresses some of these structural infirmities?
I think we need to reinvent ourselves. We need to stop being less complacent. But most of all, we just need to understand our predicament. People have been in denial until now. I think one healthy thing about the election of Trump is simply that it's forced more people to ask, what the heck is going on here, whether they're for him or against him. It was not really an expected event, and it's been a kind of wake-up call. So, I think in the long run, I really am an optimist. But, we're only going to get to the other side of the road by putting up with a lot of pain.
Yeah, it's not the old economist joke. An economist comes to a ravine, and you need to get to the other side. Assume a bridge. We can't assume a bridge, right?
Can't assume a bridge. But the ravine, we don't need to assume. We see it.
He is Tyler Cowen, professor of economics at George Mason University. Give our regards to Walter Williams. And
I will.
The author of the new book, The Complacent Class, The Self-Defeating Quest for the American Dream, and also, as I said, the curator of an excellent blog on economics, Marginal Revolution. Tyler Cowen, thanks so much for joining us. Good luck with the book.
Thank you.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.